Shifting focus now to Iran, a lot happening there. It's placed its armed forces on the highest level of alert, in fact, as the violence linked to the ongoing protests coincides with renewed fears of a wider regional confrontation. Iranian state media reporting that hundreds of units from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as well as Iran's regular army are now on full operational readiness, amid what officials describe as mounting external threats from the United States as well as Israel. And on Thursday, Iran's foreign minister has said the country is prepared for both war and negotiations amid concerns about military strikes against Iran by Israel and the United States.
We are fully prepared for any situation. We don't want war, but we are ready for war. We are also ready for negotiations, but only negotiations that are based off mutual interests and respect.
Iranian military commanders, in fact, say the move is defensive in nature, aimed at deterrence, and insist that the country is prepared to respond to any attack on its territory. At the same time, Iran is grappling with nearly 2 weeks of massive nationwide protests. These protests, driven by economic hardship, sharp price rises and the collapse of the country's currency. Demonstrations were reported in at least 25 of Iran's 31 provinces, making this one of the most geographically widespread protest movement in recent years. On Wednesday, new protests were reported in several parts. There were protests in Tehran's Shemiran district and also in the Gulf port of Bandar Abbas. Protesters were heard chanting slogans calling for economic relief, political reform and greater freedom. Because of the scale of the demonstrations, questions have now emerged on whether this is the most serious challenge to Iran's Islamic regime. In fact, authorities say some demonstrations have remained peaceful, but others have turned violent. Iranian news agencies reported attacks on the police, on shops, on religious sites in parts of the country, including deadly clashes in the southwest that left 2 police officers dead, dozens injured. So far, the violence around the demonstrations reportedly killed at least 38 people. That's the figure at this point, while more than 2,200 others have been detained. The president, Masoud Pezeshkian, earlier publicly urged restraint, remember. According to the state media, he has ordered security forces not to crack down on the demonstrators, drawing a distinction between peaceful protesters and what authorities describe as armed rioters. His office saying law enforcement has been instructed to avoid excessive force while protecting public order and critical infrastructure. But then even as the regime calls for calm at home, Iran's military leadership is warning against pressure from abroad. The commander of Iran's army has said that Tehran would not tolerate any foreign threats without responding. He said that any miscalculations by Iran's adversaries would trigger a stronger response than during last June's brief conflict with Israel. His comments, in fact, following recent warnings, remember, from US President Donald Trump as well as the Israeli Prime Minister. Trump warned Tehran against killing protesters, and then Netanyahu expressed support for the protesters in Iran, in a way framing it as a struggle for freedom. Comments that Iranian officials view as outside interference. And these statements have heightened concern in Iran, particularly after Washington's recent capture of the Venezuelan president, which also raised anxiety among some Iranian officials about the precedent that those developments could set. And adding to all of this is the fact that Kurdish opposition parties based in Iraq have also called for a general strike in Iranian Kurdish regions. They have accused the Iranian authorities of heavy-handed tactics. Just for context here, Tehran has long regarded these groups as security threats, and any escalation in the border regions could further strain an already fragile situation. For now, Iran's leadership saying they remain firmly in control, backed by a powerful network of military, political, religious institutions. Despite what the critics are saying, regional observers are also saying that leadership change is unlikely in the near term. Yes, with protests continuing and the economy under pressure in this manner, regional tensions are running high. And the coming days will be critical in determining whether restraint holds or whether rising violence and war fears push this crisis into an even more dangerous phase. The world is watching a deeply troubling moment in global politics unfold, and Donald Trump continues to remain at the heart of it. He is once again fixated on Greenland, a vast ice-covered island that is part of NATO ally Denmark. In fact, the consequences of Trump's actions could also very well shake the very foundation of the NATO alliance. The most powerful member of NATO is openly discussing the possibility of taking territory from another NATO member. This is not just diplomatic noise. This is a direct threat to the NATO's core principle that all members stand together against outside aggression. Let's just break this down. NATO was built in 1949 to face external enemies. First, the Soviet Union, and later threats like Russia, global terrorism. It was never designed to survive a situation where one member turns on another. Article 5, which is the heart of the NATO, says an attack on one is an attack on all. But what happens when the attacker is the United States itself in a way? That question strikes at the NATO's very existence. And both Greenland and Denmark have made it clear the island is not for sale. But there is precedent here. The United States had bought what are now the US Virgin Islands, remember, from Denmark in 1917 for $25 million in gold. And in today's rates, that will be over $600 million. Denmark had initially resisted the deal, but agreed after the United States threatened force after the Second World War. Then US President had made his own offer, remember, to buy Greenland, but was rebuffed. Trump has now repeatedly refused to rule out force to seize Greenland, thereby infuriating allies Denmark and Europe.
As the Danish Prime Minister recently recalled, Greenland is not for sale. It is not for the taking. We are no longer in the era when one could buy or sell Louisiana, and therefore these intimidations must stop. And Denmark knows it can count on the solidarity of European countries, which reaffirmed this through their heads of state and government in a joint statement no later than yesterday.
It is absolutely clear that the fate of Greenland will be decided by the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, to whose territory Greenland belongs. The principles enshrined in the UN Charter, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the inviolability of borders, must be respected. All questions concerning security in the Arctic region must, of course, be discussed within the NATO framework, and that is what we are doing.
Trump arguing that Greenland is a national security necessity. And there is a strategic reality here. In 2024, it lost 2.5 million liters of fresh water per second. 2.5 million liters of fresh water per second. Melting Arctic ice is opening up new shipping routes. Greenland holds rare minerals, remember, and both Russia and China have increased their military and economic presence in the Arctic. But the strategy does not justify destabilizing your own alliance. At the same time, Donald Trump is pushing for a massive military expansion, a defense budget of $1.5 trillion by 2027. He calls it a dream military funded by tariffs and designed for what he describes as troubled and dangerous times. In fact, Washington is preparing for future great power conflicts with Beijing, Moscow, and beyond, reportedly. But in doing so, it may be unraveling the very alliance that has actually kept Europe stable for decades. Regarded as the world's largest security alliance, NATO is already strained by the war in Ukraine. Allies are struggling to maintain unity, be it supplying Kiev or a plan for Europe's long-term security for that matter. A confrontation over Greenland would divert attention, divide allies, and also undermine trust. Very important. Experts are warning that NATO's credibility in itself is at stake. When a leading member undermines another or tries to undermine another, it sends out a clear message to the world that the alliance is fracturing from within. And if the NATO were to weaken or collapse, there is one man who would celebrate the loudest, of course, the Russian president. Moscow for years has dreamt of a divided West. NATO has been the single greatest obstacle to Russian expansion and power. A broken NATO would basically hand the Kremlin a historic strategic victory without a single shot fired. Imagine that. China, of course, would also take note. And this is what is happening in Greenland. And this is why it matters. Shifting focus now to the United States. In Minneapolis, residents are angry and they have gathered for a vigil. What are they demanding? They want government accountability after a U.S. immigration officer shot and killed a woman during an enforcement operation, an incident that is now raising urgent questions about the use of force and immigration policing in the United States at this point. The woman, identified by local media as a 37-year-old, was shot inside her car as immigration officers approached and attempted to open her door. Video footage showing one masked immigration and customs enforcement agent firing 3 times as the vehicle of that woman begins to pull away. And as the car and the driver is shot at, it veers out of control, crashes into parked vehicles. The woman was later seen slumped inside the wrecked vehicle, bleeding heavily. She died at the scene.
What? They just shot at somebody.
I hear 3 gunshots, and then I hear a car crash, and then I come out out the house. I see this lady hugging the victim. It's the lady's wife. So the wife is hugging her victim, hugging her wife and stuff like that.
So what exactly happened in those moments, and what does that tell you about the state of America at this point? Federal authorities saying the officer acted in self-defense. Homeland Security Secretary, in fact, called the incident a tragedy and avoidable, but then later went on to describe the incident as an act of domestic terrorism, accusing the woman who was killed of weaponizing a vehicle.
ICE agents repeatedly ordered her to get out of the car and to stop obstructing law enforcement, but she refused to obey their commands. She then proceeded to weaponize her vehicle, and she attempted to run a law enforcement officer over. This appears as an attempt to kill or to cause bodily harm to agents, an act of domestic terrorism. The ICE officer, fearing for his life and the other officers around him and the safety of the public, fired defensive shots. He used his training to save his own life and that of his colleagues.
Even U.S. President Donald Trump accused the victim of viciously running over the agent. But then local leaders there sharply reject that account. The mayor, Jacob Frey, accused the Trump administration of mischaracterizing the incident, urging the federal immigration officers to leave the city. The Minnesota governor, meanwhile, called the federal response propaganda, pledging a full, fair and expedited investigation. America is outraged. The shooting has also sparked immediate protests across Minneapolis, with thousands taking to the streets despite the freezing temperatures.
For far too long to this country, and it was the native people.
Let's burst down the sidewalk.
Take a stand!
Rise up! Take a stand! No justice! Power to the people!
The demonstrators carried signs demanding an end to federal immigration operations in the city.
We will not put up with ICE. Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe.
Show me what community looks like.
This is what community looks like.
The woman's killing after 9:30 a.m. was recorded on video by witnesses. The shooting quickly drew a large crowd of angry protesters, and by evening, hundreds were there for a vigil to mourn her death, urging the public to resist immigration enforcers. Some held signs opposing the immigration agency and chanted, "No Trump, no troops, we will not put up with ICE." Listen in.
This is what community looks like. Tell me what community looks like. This is what community looks like. Ain't Lincoln, no Trump, no Trump, no truth, no truth. Twin cities ain't Lincoln.
And in New York, people carried out protests against the immigration agency. On social media, netizens expressed outrage. Critics questioned, where does one even draw the line between law enforcement and violence? And at what point does an attempt to flee become a lethal threat?
I want to thank you for being a real New Yorker.
Ice out of New York! Ice out of New York! Ice out of New York!
They are separating children.
Now, just for further context, the shooting took place during protest activity against immigration enforcement in southern Minneapolis. Remember, the agents have been at the forefront of the Trump administration's aggressive deportation drive, which basically aims to remove what the officials describe as millions of undocumented migrants. In order to do so, the Department of Homeland Security, in fact, has expanded recruitment, adding thousands of new agents. A move that critics also say risks placing insufficiently trained officers into high-pressure situations. And as for the victim herself, here's what we know so far. As per reports, she was a U.S. citizen. She had no past legal issues aside from a traffic ticket, reportedly. She was a mother of 3. She had moved to Minneapolis last year and, according to the Minnesota Star Tribune, was living in the city with her current partner and her youngest son. Her ex-husband reportedly told news agencies that she had dropped off her 6-year-old son at school and was driving home when they encountered a group of immigration agents on the street. So even though the Trump administration officials have tried to label her as a radical leftist and a domestic terrorist, quote unquote, her ex-husband says she was not an activist and never participated in any protest. For now, investigations are underway. Protests continue, but America, and especially Minneapolis, continues to mourn. To stay up to speed with the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.